If the maid hadn't spilled that cup of coffee that morning, I probably wouldn't be here telling this story. I remember the steam rising slowly from the porcelain cup as it sat in front of me on the small breakfast table by the kitchen window. It was a quiet morning, the kind that makes a house feel almost peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the white curtains, laying soft lines of light across the hardwood floor. For a moment, everything felt normal. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, and for most of my life I believed that the hardest things in life had already happened to me. I had buried my husband, run the family company through 2 recessions, and raised a son I thought would always stand beside me. I believed I understood loyalty. I believed I understood family. That morning began like so many others. The house was calm, the smell of fresh coffee filling the kitchen. I had an important meeting later that day with the board of Whitmore Manufacturing, the company my late husband built nearly 40 years ago in a small warehouse outside Cleveland. Over time it grew into something bigger than we ever imagined. Now the board wanted to discuss a transition of leadership. My son Daniel had been talking about it for months. He believed it was time for him to step in fully. I had not yet decided. I was still thinking. Still watching. Still listening. That was when Vanessa walked into the kitchen carrying the cup. Vanessa is my daughter-in-law. She married Daniel 8 years ago, and from the beginning she had the kind of smile people trust too easily. Perfect posture. Perfect manners. Perfect timing with every word she said. "Good morning, Margaret," she said softly as she placed the cup in front of me. "I thought you might need some coffee before the meeting today." It surprised me. Vanessa had never been particularly interested in my morning routine before. I usually made my own coffee. Still, I smiled politely. "That's very thoughtful," I told her. The cup was warm in my hands. Dark roast. Exactly the way I usually take it. I lifted it slightly, watching the thin curl of steam rise into the sunlight. Vanessa stood there for a moment, her hands folded neatly, watching me with that same patient smile. Then she said she had a call to take upstairs and left the room. I remember thinking it was unusual how quiet the house suddenly felt after she left. Just the ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I brought the cup closer to my lips. And then everything changed in a second. Rosa, our housekeeper, rushed into the kitchen carrying a stack of folded laundry. She moved quickly, not seeing the chair leg in her path. Her elbow clipped the edge of the table. The cup tipped. Coffee spilled across the wood with a sharp splash and ran in thin brown streams across the floor. "Oh my goodness, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry," Rosa said immediately, grabbing a towel from the counter. I remember sighing and setting the saucer down. "It's all right," I told her calmly. Accidents happen. At the time, that was all it seemed like. Just a small, inconvenient mess on a quiet morning. Rosa knelt on the floor, wiping the coffee quickly before it could spread further. The smell of it filled the room even stronger now. I stood up slowly and stepped aside to give her space. For a moment I looked down at the dark stain spreading across the wood before the towel absorbed it. I remember thinking I would simply make another cup later. I had no idea that the coffee soaking into that floor had just spared me from something I couldn't yet see. And I certainly had no idea that the woman who placed that cup in front of me was about to change everything I believed about the people sitting at my own family table. I did not make another cup of coffee that morning. Instead, I wiped the last damp circle from the table with a paper towel and checked the time on the wall clock. 8:23 in the morning. The board meeting was scheduled for 9:30 at the Whitmore Manufacturing headquarters downtown, about 20 minutes away if traffic was kind. I told Rosa again that it was not a problem and that accidents happen to everyone. She still looked embarrassed as she carried the damp towels toward the laundry room. The floor looked clean again, although a faint dark patch remained where the coffee had soaked into the wood before she could wipe it away. I remember staring at that mark for a moment longer. Then necessary, though at the time I did not know why. Then I picked up my leather folder from the kitchen counter and walked toward the front hallway to get my coat. Whitmore Manufacturing had been part of my life for nearly 4 decades. My husband, Thomas Whitmore, started it with 2 machines in a rented warehouse when Daniel was still in elementary school. We built agricultural components for small farms across Ohio and Pennsylvania. Nothing glamorous. Just solid work and honest contracts. When Thomas passed away 12 years ago, people expected the company to fade. Instead, I stepped into the office he left behind and continued running it. Slowly, carefully, one decision at a time. Some people were surprised that a 60-year-old widow could keep a manufacturing company steady. I never argued with them. I simply did the work. Daniel joined the company officially 5 years ago. At first he was eager and attentive. He asked questions, learned the operations, studied the financial reports. But over the last year something had changed. The conversations became shorter. The patience became thinner. And Vanessa began appearing more often at company events, board dinners, and planning sessions. She had a way of listening quietly while others spoke, her expression calm and thoughtful, as if she were memorizing every detail in the room. I put on my coat and stepped outside into the cool Ohio morning. The air smelled like early fall. Crisp leaves and distant rain. My driver, Harold, was already waiting near the car at the end of the driveway. He opened the rear door when he saw me approaching. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said politely. "Good morning, Harold," I replied as I settled into the seat. As we drove through the quiet suburban streets, I reviewed the meeting notes inside my folder. The board wanted to discuss a leadership transition plan. Daniel had suggested it several times during the past month. He believed the company needed younger direction. More aggressive growth. Faster expansion into new markets. I was not opposed to new ideas, but I believed stability had its own value. The factory employed nearly 200 people now. Families depended on those paychecks. Reckless decisions could damage more than a balance sheet. 20 minutes later, the brick building of Whitmore Manufacturing came into view. I had seen that building thousands of times, but that morning something felt slightly different. Not wrong. Just different. The parking lot already held several cars belonging to board members. Daniel stood near the entrance speaking with someone on his phone. Vanessa was beside him, dressed in a tailored cream-colored jacket, her posture straight and confident. As our car stopped near the front steps, Daniel ended the call and waved with a polite smile. I stepped out and adjusted my coat. Vanessa approached me first. "Margaret, I hope you had a good morning," she said warmly. "We are all ready for the meeting." Her tone was perfectly pleasant. Perfectly respectful. I nodded calmly. "I am sure we will have a productive discussion," I replied. For a brief second her eyes shifted toward Daniel, then back to me. It was the smallest glance. Most people would not notice it. But after 72 years of watching people across conference tables, I had learned something simple. When someone is waiting for something to happen, their eyes always reveal it first. At the time I still believed this meeting would simply be another business discussion about the future of the company. I did not yet realize how carefully that morning had been arranged, or how one spilled cup of coffee back in my kitchen had already changed the outcome of everything that was about to unfold. The conference room on the second floor of Whitmore Manufacturing had not changed much in 20 years. The long oak table still held the faint marks of countless meetings, coffee cups, and stacks of reports that had passed across its surface. Sunlight came through the tall windows facing the parking lot, casting pale rectangles across the carpet. I took my usual seat at the head of the table and placed my leather folder neatly in front of me. The board members greeted me with polite nods as they settled into their chairs. Some of them had worked with my husband long before I stepped into the company. Others had joined more recently when the business expanded into new markets. Daniel sat halfway down the table on my right side, his posture relaxed but attentive. Vanessa took a seat beside him, even though she was not officially a member of the board. No one objected. Over the past year she had attended enough meetings that her presence no longer surprised anyone. Still, I noticed how carefully she observed every person in the room. Her hands rested calmly on the table while her eyes moved quietly from one speaker to the next. The meeting began the way most meetings do. Financial reports were reviewed. Production numbers were discussed. Our operations manager explained the recent shipment delays caused by a shortage of steel components from one of our suppliers in Indiana. I listened patiently, occasionally asking a question or requesting clarification on certain figures. After nearly 30 minutes the discussion turned to the subject Daniel had been waiting for. Leadership transition. One of the board members cleared his throat gently and slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were several printed documents outlining a proposed restructuring plan for the company. Daniel began explaining the details with confident energy. He spoke about modernization, aggressive expansion, and the importance of adapting to changing markets. His voice was steady and well prepared. Vanessa watched him with quiet approval, occasionally nodding at certain points in his presentation. I read the documents slowly. Some of the ideas were reasonable. Others felt rushed. There were sections discussing the transfer of operational authority and long-term voting control within the board structure. It was not unusual for companies to plan succession carefully. Still, something about the speed of this proposal unsettled me slightly. I lifted my eyes from the page and looked across the table at Daniel. "This is quite a comprehensive plan," I said calmly. "How long have you been working on this?" Daniel smiled politely. "Several months," he answered. "I wanted to make sure everything was prepared before presenting it to you and the board." Vanessa leaned slightly forward. "Daniel has put a great deal of thought into the future of the company," she added in a gentle tone. "It could open many opportunities." I nodded slowly and continued reading the final page. The room was quiet except for the soft turning of paper. For a moment I thought about my husband standing in this same room decades ago, explaining his ideas for a small manufacturing operation that no one believed would last 10 years. Now his company sat at the center of a conversation about its next generation of leadership. I closed the folder carefully and folded my hands on the table. "I appreciate the effort that went into preparing this proposal," I said. "But decisions like this deserve careful consideration. I will review the documents in detail before making any commitments." Daniel's expression remained polite, though I noticed a brief flicker of disappointment cross his face. Vanessa did not speak, but her eyes moved quickly toward him and then back to me. Again it was only a second. Just a small exchange of glances that most people would ignore. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, covering routine matters and scheduling future discussions. Eventually the board members gathered their papers and began leaving the room. Daniel approached me near the door. "Take your time reviewing the proposal," he said. "We can discuss it again later this week." I nodded. "That sounds reasonable." Vanessa stood a few steps behind him, her expression composed and thoughtful. As I walked toward the hallway I felt that same quiet sense of something being slightly out of place, though I still could not explain why. At that moment the morning spilled coffee seemed like nothing more than a small accident back in my kitchen. Yet somewhere in the back of my mind a simple question had begun to form. Why had Vanessa been so eager to bring me that cup in the first place? I left the Whitmore manufacturing building shortly after noon that day, carrying the same leather folder under my arm and the same quiet feeling that something about the morning had not settled correctly in my mind. Harold was waiting near the front entrance as usual, standing beside the car with the patient posture of someone who had spent many years working for the same family. He opened the door for me and asked if I would like to return home. I nodded and thanked him, settling back into the seat as the car moved slowly out of the parking lot. The sky had grown slightly darker since the morning, thin clouds drifting across the Ohio sunlight. I watched the factory building disappear in the side mirror and thought about the conversation in the boardroom. Daniel had spoken confidently. The proposal he presented was organized and carefully written. On the surface there was nothing alarming about a son preparing to lead the company his father built. Many families had done the same. Still, a small part of my mind kept returning to that moment in the kitchen earlier that morning. Vanessa standing beside the table. The cup of coffee placed gently in front of me. The patient smile. Then the spill. The timing of it all felt strangely precise, though I could not explain why that thought stayed with me. When we reached the house, Harold offered to carry my folder inside, but I told him it was not necessary. The house was quiet when I entered. Daniel and Vanessa had gone back to their own home after the meeting. Rosa must have finished her cleaning and left for the day because the hallway lights were off and the kitchen stood silent. I placed my coat on the rack and walked slowly into the kitchen. The faint smell of coffee still lingered in the air. The morning sunlight had shifted across the room, leaving the table in shadow now. I stepped closer and looked down at the hardwood floor where the spill had happened. The wood had dried, but the faint stain remained. It was darker than I expected, almost like a thin ring pressed into the grain. I crouched slightly and ran my fingers across the spot. The surface felt rougher than the rest of the floor, as if the liquid had left some kind of mark behind. That was unusual. I had spilled coffee before in this kitchen many times over the years. It never left a mark like that. I stood there for a moment, studying the floor. The silence in the room made every small sound noticeable. The refrigerator humming softly. The ticking of the clock above the doorway. I walked to the sink and filled a glass with water, then returned and poured a few drops carefully onto the stained area. The water touched the wood and spread slightly along the grain. For a moment nothing happened. Then I noticed something subtle. The edges of the stain seemed to darken further, almost reacting to the moisture. It was not dramatic. Just a slight change that made the mark appear deeper than before. I straightened slowly and looked toward the counter where the coffee machine sat. Vanessa had made the coffee that morning before bringing it to the table. She had been unusually attentive. Unusually helpful. I tried to remember the last time she had personally brought me coffee in this house. I could not recall a single occasion. That realization sat quietly in my mind as I wiped the water from the floor with a small towel. The mark remained. I walked to the cabinet and took out a bottle of wood cleaner, spraying a small amount onto the cloth before rubbing the stain carefully. It faded only slightly. Something about that detail refused to leave my thoughts. Coffee alone should not leave a mark like that. I placed the cloth on the counter and stood still for several seconds, looking around the quiet kitchen where the morning had begun so normally. A simple cup of coffee. A simple accident. Yet the longer I looked at that dark spot on the floor, the more a quiet question settled in my mind. What exactly had been in that cup? That question stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that the dark stain on the kitchen floor meant nothing more than a strong roast of coffee soaking into old wood. Still, the longer I thought about it, the less comfortable that explanation felt. I have spent many years running a manufacturing company, and one thing experience teaches you is that small details often reveal larger truths. Machines fail because of tiny overlooked parts. Contracts collapse because of one quiet clause in the fine print. Life rarely announces its most important moments loudly. More often it whispers through small irregularities. By early evening the house had grown dim as the sun lowered behind the trees outside the backyard. I turned on the kitchen light and prepared a simple dinner for myself, though my appetite was not particularly strong. The leather folder from the meeting sat unopened on the counter beside the stove. Daniel's proposal was still waiting for my decision, but my thoughts were not focused on the company anymore. They kept circling back to the same moment in the morning. Vanessa standing beside the table. The careful way she had placed the cup in front of me. The way she watched me for a second before leaving the room. After dinner I walked slowly back into the kitchen and looked again at the faint stain on the floor. It had dried completely now, but the mark had not faded. If anything, it appeared slightly deeper than before. I knelt down again and touched the wood. The texture still felt rough compared to the surrounding surface. That was when another thought occurred to me. Rosa had wiped the spill quickly. With a towel. She had moved fast, almost nervously, apologizing over and over again. At the time I assumed she was simply embarrassed about making a mess. But Rosa had worked in this house for nearly 4 years. She was careful and steady in everything she did. Spilling a cup of coffee was not impossible, but it was unusual. I stood up and walked toward the hallway where the small desk phone rested near the living room doorway. Rosa usually finished her shift by 3 in the afternoon, but sometimes she stayed later when there was extra laundry or cleaning to finish. I dialed the number she had given me when she first began working for us. It rang twice before she answered. Her voice sounded slightly hesitant when she realized it was me. I asked her how the rest of her day had gone and thanked her again for her work around the house. Then I mentioned the coffee spill casually. I told her I noticed the floor had a small stain where the liquid had soaked in. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before she spoke again. She told me she had noticed the same thing while cleaning earlier. In fact, she said something about the spill had seemed strange to her as well. I asked what she meant. Rosa explained that when she wiped the coffee with the towel, the fabric had felt slightly stiff afterward, almost as if something other than coffee had soaked into it. She had rinsed the towel several times in the sink before placing it in the washing machine. At the time she assumed it was simply a stronger blend of coffee than usual. But hearing me mention the stain on the floor made her remember that moment again. I thanked her for telling me and ended the call politely. Then I returned to the kitchen and stood silently beside the table where the morning had begun. The house felt very still around me. Outside the windows the evening light was fading into darkness. I looked once more at the dark mark on the floor and realized something simple and unsettling at the same time. The coffee Vanessa had brought me that morning might not have been just coffee at all. I stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time that evening, staring at the dark stain on the hardwood floor as if it might explain itself if I simply waited long enough. The house around me felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because my thoughts had begun arranging the events of the morning in a new order. Vanessa had brought the coffee. That alone was unusual. Rosa had spilled it before I could take a sip. The liquid had left a strange mark on the wood and stiffened the cleaning towel. None of these details proved anything by themselves. But together they created a pattern that refused to disappear from my mind. I have always believed that when something does not make sense, the best response is patience. Reacting too quickly can destroy the chance to see the full picture. So instead of confronting anyone or making accusations, I simply turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly upstairs to my study. The room overlooked the backyard and held the same desk I had used for years to review company reports and contracts. I placed Daniel's proposal folder on the desk and sat quietly in the chair for a few minutes, listening to the faint sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Then I opened the folder again and began reading more carefully than I had during the meeting earlier that day. The documents described a transfer of operational authority over the next 6 months. If approved, Daniel would become the primary decision-maker for Whitmore Manufacturing. There were also additional pages discussing voting rights within the board structure and adjustments to the company trust that held the majority of the shares. None of it looked illegal or improper. In fact, the paperwork was professionally prepared and thoroughly organized. Yet one sentence in the financial appendix caught my attention. It described how the company trust would be redistributed if the current owner became unable to continue managing the business due to health circumstances or unexpected events. In that scenario, the control of the trust would move immediately to Daniel Whitmore as the next designated family executive. That detail alone would not normally concern me. Many family companies include similar clauses to protect stability. But the timing of everything else that morning made the line stand out more clearly than it might have otherwise. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together, thinking quietly. If something had been wrong with the coffee, the symptoms might not appear instantly. Some substances affect the body gradually rather than immediately. I did not like where that thought was leading, but ignoring it would not make it disappear. After a few minutes I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Richard Cole. Richard had served as the company's legal advisor for nearly 15 years. More importantly, he had been a close friend of my late husband long before that. When I called, he answered on the second ring with his usual calm voice. I told him I needed a small favor that might sound unusual. I explained the coffee spill in the kitchen that morning and the strange mark it left on the floor. There was a short silence before he spoke again, more serious this time. Richard said that if I truly felt something was unusual, the safest approach would be to collect a sample of whatever residue remained and have it examined by a professional laboratory. He also suggested that until we understood more, it would be wise not to mention my concerns to anyone else in the family. His advice matched my own instincts. After ending the call, I returned downstairs to the kitchen and carefully cut a small piece of the paper towel I had used earlier to wipe the floor. It still carried a faint brown stain from the spill. I placed it into a clean envelope and sealed it slowly. The kitchen was silent again as I set the envelope on the counter. Tomorrow morning I would deliver it to a laboratory Richard recommended. Perhaps the results would prove that I was worrying over nothing more than an ordinary cup of coffee. But as I turned off the lights and walked toward the stairs, one quiet realization settled firmly in my mind. If the test revealed anything unusual at all, then the accident that morning had not simply made a mess on my kitchen floor. It might have saved my life. I woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen above the trees behind the house. The envelope containing the small piece of stained paper towel rested on the kitchen counter exactly where I had left it the night before. For a moment I stood quietly beside it, listening to the stillness of the house. Mornings used to feel peaceful here. After Thomas passed away, I learned to appreciate those quiet hours before the rest of the world began moving again. But that morning the silence felt different, as if the house itself was waiting for something to be revealed. I made a fresh cup of coffee for myself, carefully measuring the beans and watching the machine drip slowly into the glass pot. The smell filled the kitchen in the familiar way it always had. When I poured the coffee into my cup, I paused for a second before taking the first sip. It was a small moment, but I noticed it clearly. After everything that had happened the previous day, the simple act of drinking coffee no longer felt automatic. I placed the cup down and looked again at the dark mark on the hardwood floor. The stain had not faded overnight. If anything, the edges looked slightly more defined in the morning light. I finished my coffee slowly, then sealed the envelope again and placed it inside my purse. By 8 o'clock I was already in the car with Harold driving toward the laboratory Richard had recommended. The building was located in a quiet office park about 15 miles outside the city. From the outside it looked ordinary, just another professional facility with clean windows and a modest sign near the entrance. Inside, the reception desk was staffed by a young technician who greeted me politely and asked how they could assist. I explained that I had a small sample I wanted examined and that Richard Cole had suggested their laboratory. The technician nodded with professional calm and asked me to fill out a short form describing the material and the circumstances. I kept my explanation simple. Residue from a spilled beverage on a hardwood floor. Nothing more. After handing over the envelope, I was told that preliminary results might be available within 24 hours. Some analyses could take longer depending on what substances were involved. I thanked them and returned to the car feeling strangely calm. The decision had been made. Now all that remained was patience. Harold drove me back toward Whitmore Manufacturing because I still had work waiting at the office. The factory floor was already active when I arrived, machines humming steadily as workers moved between stations preparing orders for shipment. The routine felt reassuring. Numbers. Production schedules, supply deliveries. These were problems that could be solved with clear thinking and careful planning. People, however, were different. People could hide intentions behind polite smiles. I spent most of the morning reviewing contracts and speaking with department managers. Daniel stopped by my office around noon. He asked if I had begun reviewing the transition proposal more closely. His voice sounded relaxed, almost optimistic. I told him I was still considering it and would need a little more time before making any decisions. He nodded and said that was understandable. Vanessa appeared briefly in the doorway behind him, offering a polite greeting before reminding him that they had another appointment across town. She smiled at me with the same calm expression she always carried. Watching her in that moment, it would have been impossible for anyone to suspect that anything unusual had happened the day before. Yet as they walked down the hallway together, a quiet thought settled in my mind. Somewhere in a laboratory across the city, someone was beginning to examine the residue from that spilled cup of coffee. And when the results finally arrived, they would either confirm that my concerns were nothing more than imagination or reveal that the accident in my kitchen had prevented something far more serious from unfolding. I returned home later that evening with the same quiet routine I had followed for years, yet every step through the house now carried a different awareness. The hallway lights glowed softly as I set my purse on the entry table and removed my coat. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it had that morning and the night before. The coffee machine sat neatly on the counter. The chairs were tucked beneath the table. And the dark stain on the hardwood floor remained where the spilled cup had soaked into the wood. I paused beside it again, not because I expected it to change, but because it had already become a silent reminder of how quickly an ordinary moment could shift into something far more complicated. I prepared a light dinner and ate slowly while reviewing a few documents from the office, but my attention kept drifting toward the phone resting on the counter. The laboratory had told me that preliminary results might take a full day. I reminded myself of that several times as the evening passed. Patience had always been one of the most valuable skills in business, and it was no less important now. Around 8:30 the phone finally rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but I already knew who it would be. I answered calmly and heard a professional voice introduce himself as the technician who had processed the sample I delivered earlier that morning. He explained that the laboratory had completed an initial analysis of the residue on the paper towel. His tone remained neutral and careful, the way trained professionals speak when delivering information that may be significant. He said the sample did not contain only coffee. According to their preliminary findings, the residue also included traces of a chemical compound that did not belong in a normal beverage. He did not use dramatic language. He simply explained that the substance appeared to be something that could interfere with the body's natural rhythm if consumed in certain amounts. He emphasized that the laboratory could not determine exactly how it entered the liquid or what the intended concentration might have been without a larger sample. However, he recommended that the matter be treated seriously and advised consulting a physician or legal authority if necessary. I thanked him for the information and ended the call slowly. The kitchen was silent again after the conversation ended, yet the silence felt heavier now. The question that had been forming in my mind since the previous morning no longer existed as a suspicion alone. The spilled coffee had contained something else. Something that should never have been in a cup placed on a breakfast table. I stood beside the counter for several minutes thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. Vanessa bringing the coffee. Rosa accidentally knocking it over. The stain on the floor. The towel that stiffened when it dried. Every small detail had pointed quietly in the same direction. Yet even with the laboratory confirmation, I did not feel anger the way some people might expect. What I felt instead was clarity. Clarity about the situation and about the people involved in it. The next step would require patience and careful thinking. Confrontation without preparation would only give others time to create explanations. Instead, I walked upstairs to my study and opened the leather folder containing Daniel's proposal for the company transition. I read every page again under the desk lamp, paying close attention to the sections discussing ownership and control of the company trust. By the time I finished, the connection between those documents and the laboratory results felt impossible to ignore. If something had happened to me suddenly, Daniel would inherit the authority to lead Whitmore Manufacturing immediately. And Vanessa, who had been encouraging the transition plan from the beginning, would stand beside him as the new leadership took shape. I closed the folder quietly and leaned back in the chair, looking out the window into the dark backyard. The house remained peaceful, the same way it had always been. But I now understood something important. The accident in my kitchen had not simply prevented a strange cup of coffee from being consumed. It had exposed a plan that someone believed would never be discovered. And now that I understood what had almost happened, the question was no longer whether the truth existed. The question was how and when I would choose to reveal it. I slept very little that night. The house was quiet, but my mind kept replaying the same sequence of events over and over again, each time with greater clarity. The coffee. Vanessa placing it in front of me with that polite smile. Rosa bumping the cup just before I could take a sip. The stain on the floor. The laboratory results. By the time the first pale light of morning appeared through the curtains, I had already decided what my next step would be. Truth, I have learned over the years, reveals itself best when people believe they are completely safe. If confronted too early, they will retreat behind excuses and confusion. But when they feel confident, they often speak more freely than they intend. That morning I called Daniel and asked him and Vanessa to come to the house that afternoon for a short discussion about the company proposal. My voice remained calm and neutral, the same way it always sounded during business conversations. Daniel seemed pleased when he answered. He said they would arrive around 3 o'clock. After the call ended, I prepared the house the way I normally would before receiving family guests. I brewed fresh coffee. I arranged a small tray with cups on the dining table. And then I placed a thin folder beside my chair containing the laboratory report that had arrived by email earlier that morning, confirming the technician's findings in more detail. Shortly before 3 o'clock, Daniel and Vanessa arrived together. Vanessa entered first with the same composed smile she always wore in public settings. Daniel followed behind her carrying the familiar leather folder that held the company transition proposal. We exchanged polite greetings and sat at the dining table. For a few minutes the conversation remained ordinary. Daniel asked if I had reviewed the documents again. Vanessa commented that the transition plan would allow the company to grow faster in the coming years. I listened quietly, allowing them to speak. Finally I reached forward and poured coffee into 3 cups. The movement caused Vanessa's eyes to shift briefly toward the coffee pot before returning to my face. It was a very small reaction, but I noticed it clearly. I slid 1 cup toward Daniel and 1 toward Vanessa. Then I kept my own cup resting on the table without touching it. Daniel began explaining again why the transfer of authority should begin soon. His tone was confident, almost rehearsed. When he finished speaking, I opened the thin folder beside my chair and placed the printed laboratory report gently on the table between us. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Vanessa's smile faded slightly as Daniel leaned forward to read the first line of the document. I spoke calmly, the same way I would explain a financial statement during a board meeting. I told them that yesterday morning the coffee Vanessa had kindly brought me before our meeting had been spilled before I could drink it. I explained that the residue left on the floor seemed unusual, so I had sent a sample to a laboratory for analysis. The report on the table now confirmed that the coffee had contained a substance that did not belong in a normal beverage. The room grew completely silent. Daniel looked up from the paper slowly, his expression uncertain as if he was still searching for an explanation that would make sense of the situation. Vanessa remained very still in her chair. I folded my hands together and continued speaking in the same calm voice. I told them something else as well. I explained that I had also asked our attorney Richard Cole to review the transition proposal documents again after the laboratory results arrived. His office had already begun preparing legal protections to ensure that the ownership and leadership of Whitmore Manufacturing would remain secure. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone directly. I simply allowed the truth to exist in the room where it could no longer be ignored. After several seconds that felt much longer, I lifted my untouched cup of coffee and looked at the surface of the dark liquid. Then I placed it back on the table and spoke the final thought that had been forming in my mind since the previous morning. Sometimes the smallest accident changes everything. Yesterday a spilled cup of coffee made a mess on my kitchen floor. But today that same accident has revealed exactly who I can trust to sit at this table with me in the future.